Hey everyone, welcome back to the new section of JavaScript Masterclass course, and this section is going to be really exciting because now you know like all the basics of JavaScript. You know how to create data, how to perform math, how to do logic around all those variables, how to write functions, how to create objects, those name value pairs, right? And you know how to access the DOM and how to manipulate the DOM. Now the fun part start. We are going to take all of that knowledge, we are going to combine all of that knowledge together, and we are going to put it into practice by creating this expense tracker application. So I have chosen this expense tracker application, because this is really easy for the beginners. And if you're a beginner in JavaScript, you're starting with JavaScript, this is a good choice. This application, it's a really simple application. If you see here, I have that your balance 0, income 0, expense 0. Then this is a transaction history section. And then we have a add new transaction and this form, and there are different buttons. So suppose you get a salary on 1st of the month, you're going to add that as a transaction. So I'm going to put name as a salary and I'm going to put some amount, maybe 5,000. Now this is an income, right? So I'm going to click on add income button, and this area, this area is going to get updated. So this is my income. So I'm going to click on add income. See that? I got the balance as 5,000. I got the income of 5,000 and expenses 0. Now, obviously you got the salary, you're going to spend it somewhere, right? So maybe you buy some grocery and maybe you'll spend like $100 for the grocery. So that's not an income, that's an expense. So I'm going to click on add expense. See that? I got a new record added here for the grocery, $100. Expense section got updated by 100, income stays the same, and you got the balance of 4,900. Now, you might get some more money, or you might spend some money maybe in buying piano or something else, and you spend like $500. So this is again an expense. So I can add an expense. See that? I got to 600 of expense, and now my balance is 4,400. I get some more cash from somewhere else, maybe of $1,000. So this is income to me. I'll add income. So now you got the income of 6,000 and you got the balance of 5,400. I can delete my transaction from this history using this delete button. Maybe I'll delete this record of grocery. So if I remove this 100, this is going to become 500, and that 100 will get added into this balance. So I'm going to remove this. See that? So this is really simple and beautiful application which we are going to write throughout this section, and we are going to write this entire application using vanilla JavaScript, and we are going to learn a lot from this application. So I think this section is going to be fun, and I highly recommend you code along with me. So as I'm writing the code, you also write the code with me. Once we are finished with writing this application, you rewrite this entire application by yourself. And if you face any issues while writing this application, or if you get any error or bug, just let me know in the comment section so that, I can get back to you. So let's get started, and let's start with writing HTML for this application. Hello. So let's get started with the HTML structure of our application. So I'm going to start with the h1 tag. I'll give it a title of expense tracker. Let me save. You can see the output on the right hand side in the browser. And I'm going to wrap my application actually into one of the div tag. So let me wrap this h1 also in the div tag. So I'm going to take it out from here, and I'm going to put it here. So I'm going to use maybe I'll give it a class of app to this div, and everything will be inside our app. So this is my application div. We got the heading here. Now next, I want to create a balance section. So I'm going to create one more div. So I'm basically adding section by section. So this will be our balance section, and it will appear here on the right hand side one by one, and you will be able to understand like what I'm going to create. So I'm going to put h2 inside this because I have already used heading 1. Let's use heading 2 for the subheadings in our application. I'm going to call it your balance, and inside that I'm going to create one more div, and I'll give it an ID of, say, balance, because I'm going to target this div later on to populate these values which I'm putting as a hard-coded values for now. So I'll put 1000 here, and maybe I can give class to this div also. I'll call it balance container. Okay, just to write some CSS, because we are going to write CSS in the next video. I'm going to save. We got the balance section. Next, I want to have one more section. So I'll add another div. I'll give it a class of cash flow. Now this section is going to have two more small sections. So I'm going to add two different divs here. So let's start with the first div. This will be for the income. So I'll give it a class of income container, and again I'm going to use subheading of h2. I'll call this one income, and to store the income value I'll create a div and I'll put some dollar value here. Maybe income is, maybe I can put 1200 for the income, and I'm going to give it ID of income because I'm going to target this in my JavaScript later on. So this is my first section for the income. I'm going to create another section for expenses. So class expense container. I'll give it a class name of expense container. Then again I'm going to have a h2. I'll call it expense, and then another small div section for my expense. So expenses, I'm going to use a value of maybe $200, and I'm going to give it an ID of expense. Let's save. See that? So I got my balance section, income section, and the expense section. Okay, next we are going to add transaction history section. In this section, say suppose I get the salary on the first of the month, right? I'm going to add that as an income. Next, I spent some money out of the salary into grocery, right? So I can put that as an expense. So let's create another section. I'll give it a class of transaction container, and let's give it a heading of transaction history, and I'm going to have list of transactions, right? Okay, so I'm going to put first list item as salary, and if I save this, see that we got the salary, but I need to put some money, right? How much salary I got. So this is my income, right? There will be one more li. Maybe I'm going to add one more li here. Say suppose I buy some groceries. So I'll put it as a buy grocery. And if I save, like I need to specify like how much money I have spent on grocery, right? Maybe $50. So I need to show something like this. Okay, so for that, I'm going to create another section. So I'm going to add a div. This will be like a wrapper for that section. I'm going to add a span tag, and inside this span, I'm going to have that spending. So maybe I got a salary of $5,000, something like that. I'm just putting some dummy values here. And then I'm going to have one button for deleting this transaction, because maybe I want to delete the transaction also. So I'm putting this button. So we need to repeat this everywhere, like for here, I'm going to put this. Maybe for grocery, I've spent $50. Then this button, let me add one more dummy transaction here. Maybe I'll go and buy guitar. So that's my expense. So I'm going to copy this one from here, paste it here. Copy this one from, I'm going to copy this one from here and paste it here. So for buying a guitar, maybe I have spent $500. Now if I save, see that? So this is looking good. So I have my transaction history and I have list of all of my transactions. Maybe I should add some classes here. Maybe for this, I'm going to add a class of income. This will be income amount. Okay. And for this one, I'm going to add a class of expense amount because this is my expense, right? So I'll call it expense amount. And for this is also my expense. So I'm going to call it expense amount. And later on, I'm going to target all of these classes to make it beautiful, right? So I'm going to save it. Nothing has changed. So I think this looks good. All of our ULLI, all of our transaction history looks good. Next, I need one more section, for adding a new transaction here, right? These are all like history of transaction, but how can I add those transactions, right? For adding those transactions, I need to add one more div, I would say. So I'm going to add that new section. I'll give it a class of new, or I would say form container. Okay. And inside that, just let's give it a heading of add new transaction. And I'm going to use a form here. So this form is going to have different label. So first label would be for my transaction amount or transaction name, I can say. So let me try to use name property here. This is for name and I'll give it a label of name. Then I'll put input. I'm going to use ID of name and type would be text. Let's close this input. I'll put another label for the amount and type will be, this time I'm going to use number because this will be number value. Let's label it amount. Finally, let's put one more input. This input ID will be amount. Oh, sorry, I put a type at wrong place. Actually, this is not needed here. So I need to type here actually in the input field and let's close it here. Finally, I need two buttons actually. So I'm going to add two buttons here. One for, adding income and one for adding expenses. So I'm going to add a button with the label of add income and then next button will be a button with add expense. Okay, and let me give it ID also. So I'll give it income button, and this one I'll give ID of expense button. Save. I think my form looks good. So I have my expense tracker title, then the balance, income, expense, transaction history, where I'm going to show all the history of transactions. Then add new transaction form. I'm going to use this for, like, say suppose I got the salary. I'm going to enter some salary here, then the amount, maybe $2,000, and then I can click on add. Then I can click on add income or add expense, and that will get added, and that is going to get added into this transaction history section. So I think my HTML looks good. If I have forgotten something, maybe we can add in the upcoming video. So let me just go and check once again. And I think this looks good. So I think we are done with the HTML part. Let's add CSS to make this look good, in the next video. Hello. So we have our HTML structure in place. Now let's add some style to our HTML structure. So first of all, I'm going to import some of the nice fonts, from Google. So I'm going to use Google Fonts. So you just need to search for Google Fonts on Google. Click on this link. And actually I'm going to use Rupic font. So I'm going to search. So I'm going to use this one. So I'm going to click on that. And you have different styles here. So you can use different styles. So I'll go with this one, the first one, regular 400. So you just need to click on select this style button. It's going to open this pop-up. We're going to go into embed section, and I need to copy this link. So we are interested in this link. I'm going to copy this one. I'm going to copy this one and I'm going to paste it here. So we have our fonts here. Now we need to write styles. So let's get started with styles. I'm going to close this one because we don't need it now. Okay, so for CSS, I'm going to add another link tag. A rel property will be style sheet, and href will be index.css. So I'm going to write this index of CSS now. So let's create a new file. So I'm going to create a new file called index.css. Enter. And we are going to write all of our styles in this file. So I'm going to start with the body element first, and let's change the font family to the Google fonts we have added, Rubic, and default font I'm going to keep it sans serif, not serif, serif. Now if I save, see that? It's looking beautiful, right? Now I'm going to use some display property like display of flex, then flex direction will be column. So basically I'm going to align my application, that's why I'm using these properties. I need to justify my content at the center, and I'm going to align the items to the center. Now if I save, okay, so this should have aligned our application to the center. Next I'm going to target this H1, this expense tracker text, and I'm going to push it to the center. So I'm going to target the H1 tag, and maybe for specificity, I'm going to use the app class, app H1. I'm going to say text align off center. Save. This is looking much better. Next, let's target this your balance section, and we are going to style this element. So this is this part. So I have balance container. So I'm going to target this balance container, and inside that I'm going to target this div actually, and h2 also. So I'm going to use this class, and inside that I have a div with the ID of balance. So I'm going to style it. So let's target this and change the font size of this one to maybe 1.5 em. This is looking much better. And I'm going to target this text actually. So I'm going to copy this balance container. I'm going to target the h2 inside it. And I'm going to use a property called text transform. And let's transform it to uppercase. Now, this is looking good. But actually I need to transform all of these headings. So instead of specificity, I'm going to remove this part. And I'm going to target all the h2 element. And I'm going to set the text transform to uppercase. Save. See that? All the headings are like uppercase. And this is looking much better. Now let's target this income element. So for that, I need to refer my HTML. And we have a balance container. Then we have a cash flow. Okay, I should have added container here. So now I'm going to target this cash flow container. So basically, I need this income and expense containers in one line. So I'm going to align it that way. So I'm going to target this cash flow container. And inside that cash flow container, I need to style these two different div elements. So first of all, I'm going to give it a property of flex, not flex actually, display of flex. So once I save this, see that they are in one line. Now I need to style them. I need to have some spacing and all. So before doing that, I just want to put some kind of a box or some kind of drop shadow in this section. So I'm going to do that. For that, I'm going to create a variable because I'm going to use that box shadow at other places. So inside my root, I'm going to create a variable called drop shadow. And these variables are very good, I don't need to write some kind of repetitive CSS. I can have that at one place, and I'm going to paste some value here. This value, let's add a drop shadow around this container. So I'm going to use shadow, that is box shadow actually, box shadow, and I'm going to name this variable also box shadow. And let's use this variable here, dash box shadow. And now if I save, it's looking much better. Now we need to style this properly. I should have some padding and all those things. But first of all, I need to center this. So I'm going to use a property called align items at the center. Let's see what it does. I need to use justify content also probably. So I'm going to use justify content at the center. Let's save. Now it is at the center. And I see some padding on the top because of that h2 element. So I need to have some padding at the bottom. So let's target this element and add some padding at the bottom. So I'm going to use padding of bottom. Maybe I'll start with 20 pixel first. Save. This is looking much better. Now I need to target these two sections independently, to style them. So let me target the first one, that is income container, and my income container, I'm going to put border first, that is border on the right hand side. So that will be border right of 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to use this number value here. See that? We have a padding here, but we don't have a padding at the top. So let me copy this one and add padding top also. That would be around 20 pixel. This is looking much better. Now we should have some spacing between these two boxes. So I'm going to add some padding right. Maybe I need to use, let me try with the padding first. Padding right of 20 pixel. This has added spacing in the income box, but we need some padding for the expense also. So I'm going to copy this, and I know that's expense container, right? So I'm going to change this to expense container, and this time I'm going to use padding left of 20 pixel. Let's save. Cool, this is looking much better. We should have some spacing at the top also, right? So maybe I can add a margin top of 20 pixel to my cash flow container. Cool. So this section is looking good. Now I need to target these numbers. Basically they're looking a bit small, so I want to make it big. So what's the ID for them? Yes, I'm using expense and income. So let's target them using that only. So I'm going to use the ID selector, and first I'm going to target the income, and I'm going to use font size. Let's try 1.3 M's, and for the similarly I can use comma actually. I'll target expense and save. I think they're looking good. 1200, 200, nice. Next I want to color them. I mean, income is something which we like, so I would like to color them with a green color, and expense which we don't like, so I'm going to give it a color of red. So let's change the text color of these elements. So I need to target them separately actually. So I'm going to create one more selector for income, and income I'm going to give color of, let me create the variables for these colors because I think I'm going to use it. So for income I'll create a variable income, and that will be green. Income will be green, and expense will be red. So let's use these variables. So color, I'm going to use var, and here I'm going to use income. I'm going to target expense also, and color would be var expense. If I save, they're looking much better. Cool. So we are done with your balance, this section, income and expense section. Let's move on and target this transaction history, and let's style it. So to style my transaction history, let me go back to my HTML structure, and I know I have a class here, transaction container, so I can use this to target, and I'm going to target this UL. Let me put one ID here. So ID will be transaction, because I'm going to use it in JavaScript, so I'm putting some IDs, transaction, and let's target this transaction directly. So I'm going to target the transaction element, and first of all I need to remove these circles, these black circles, or we call it bullets, right? So for that I'm going to use a property called list style none, and now if I save, see that they're gone. I need to remove the margin and padding from these elements, so I'm going to remove it, save, looking good. Now I want this salary, this amount, this button, they should be in one line. So to do that, I need to target this li element. So I'm going to use my transaction only, so this ID, okay, and inside that all the LIs I'm going to target, and I'm going to give it display of flex. Cool. So now they are in one line, but I know I want this text to be on the left hand side and this amount and this button on the right hand side. how can I do that? So let's revisit the structure we have created. So I have already created this div, right, and this text. So I can push this div on the right hand side by writing a CSS property called, so I'm going to use a property called justify content, and I'm going to use this property called space evenly. Now if I save, see that it came on the right hand side, but this also came on the right hand side. So display flex, so probably I need to give it a display direction of this, sorry, the property name is flex direction, actually flex direction of row, and I'm using justify content space evenly, but I need to use another value called space between actually. And if I save this, much better, right? Now I need to have some padding around my li elements. They're like, you know, this touching each other. Let me add some padding of, let's say, 10 pixel around it. Much better, I would say. And let's add the box shadow. That will add more beauty to this transaction history items, I would say. So let's use a box shadow property, and I'm going to use a variable. See the beauty of variables? I can use it any number of times. I'm going to use my box shadow variable, and now if I save, cool, it's looking good. But again, they're touching each other, so probably, you know, I need to increase my padding. So maybe let's try to go with 20 pixel. No, actually padding will not work here. I think I need to add some margin. So I'm going to add margin bottom of 10 pixel. Save. Cool. Now it's looking much better. So the items, the transaction history items are in place, but I want to decorate it more because, you know, now next I want to target this text. So this is either income, and income is green, right? And expense is red. So why not make them red and green, right? So that's why, you know, I have created this structure, this span element where I have these classes, you know, income amount and expense amount, just to differentiate them, whether they're income or expense. So I'm going to target these now. So inside transaction, I'm going to target income amount and expense amount. So let's take this one only. I'm going to copy this one to be more specific, you know. So I'm using the specificity of CSS. So inside my li, I have a span with the class name of income dash amount. So I'm going to target this one, and this is a span, right? So first of all, I'm going to give it a display property of inline block. Then I'm going to give it a background color. This time I'm going to use variable again because I have created variable for my income and expense. So now if I save, see that? It's looking much better. Let's change the color of text to white. It will look more beautiful. Save. Cool. Let me add some padding. Maybe 5 pixel of padding will do. Save. Cool. Let's add some border radius. That will add more beauty to it. So I'm going to go with 3 pixel value. Save. Much better. Now I'm going to copy this one actually, and now I need to target expense amount, right? Expense amount. If you go back to the HTML structure, you know, I have expense amount span. So I'm targeting this one to color, you know. So okay, so this is going to have the similar properties. So I'm going to give it a display of inline block. background color of, this time the color will be different because this is an expense. So I'm going to use expense variable. Let's have a color of white, padding of 5 pixel and border radius of say 3 pixel. Now if I save, see that my expenses are in red. So this is looking good, but I have written some of the duplicate code here. If you see here, this display and this color, this padding, border radius, I have repeated my code. So why not refactor this one? So, maybe I'm going to do something like this. I'm going to target the span inside my transaction li, and I'm going to encapsulate some of the code. So I'm going to copy this one, paste here. I don't need this property, but I need all of these, right? So let's remove this from here and here. Similarly, this one and this one. So now if I save, I'm getting the similar result. So transaction history section looks good. We have colorful number values, the amount values. Maybe this button is looking a bit smaller. So let me try to add some padding to that button. So I'm going to target this button in the transaction. So let's target the button and let's try to put some padding around it. Maybe 5 pixel will do. Let's see. Looking good, but I think I should have more padding on left and right. So I'll go with that particular value. So top, I will go with 5 pixel. Right, I will go with 10 pixel. Left will be 10 pixel and bottom will be 5 pixel. Now if I save, no, it's not looking good. Okay, I need to change this number to 5. This is my bottom number and this is my left number. Save. Now it's looking much better, I would say. So I think transaction history section is looking good. So I can use this button, to delete the transaction. Now let's see how we can add transaction, right? Because these are some of the dummy transaction which I have added in my HTML file. But how can we add a new transaction, right? Maybe the income transaction or expense transaction. I should have a way. So we need to make this form work, right? So let's first style this form for adding a transaction. So I'm going to target this form. So this is a form container. So I'm going to use this class and inside that I have this form. So let's target that form and I'm going to target the form. First of all, I'm going to use the display property of flex. Next, I'm going to use flex direction property, which will be column. Looks good. Now it's in something like this. They're aligned vertically in column. I'm going to target individual elements of the form and I'm going to style it. So let's copy this. Do I have an ID for them? Yes, I have an ID for them. Let me first target the labels and style the labels. So maybe I'll put some padding bottom to my labels, maybe of 10 pixel. That will add some space. Looking good. And next I'm going to target the input elements. So I'm going to use ID for that. So what ID I have given to name? So name is name. So I'm going to target name and name will be, this is our input, type input. So I'm going to use the height property and let me give it a height of 25 pixel probably. Let's see how it looks. Okay, much better. Next, let's give it a margin bottom of 10 pixel just to add some spacing. Cool. I think I should add this to input directly, because both the input are same. So let me go something like this. I'm going to copy this one from here paste it here, and I'm going to target both the input element, and I'm going to put that style directly for the input element. So this is good. So now if I save, see, it got applied to both the elements. It's looking good. Now we need to style these buttons, right? This add income and add expense button. So again, I'm going to use this form container to be specific. I'm going to target the buttons, and let me remove the border first. So let's not have any border around the buttons. I'm going to add some padding. So maybe I'll go with 10 pixel. Okay, let's see how it looks. Cool. I need some spacing actually between the buttons, so I'm going to add some margin. So margin bottom of say 10 pixel. Now if I scroll down, cool, they're looking good, but I think this font size is really small, so I'm going to use font size property, and let's try with 1.2 em. I think they're looking much better. Let's use text transform to make them uppercase. Scroll. Cool. Now this income button, and this expense button, so I need to add the colors to them just to differentiate. When user is going to click on, say suppose user want to add cash, of $1,000, he should be able to immediately see, okay, this is add income button, so I'm going to add income. I just want to highlight this button with different colors, so I'm going to use, like for this one green color and this one red color. And this add income is a bit, let me try with 1 em, and this is looking much better, I would say. Cool. So let's target those buttons now. So I'm going to target the income button first. So I have an ID for them. So I'm going to target income button, and let's make background color of, again, I'm going to use my variables. See the beauty of variables. This will be income, so I'm going to use income, and next I have expense button, and this time I'm going to use background color of, again, a variable, and this time it will be expense. Now if I save, scroll down, see that it's looking much better, but this color, this black color is not looking good. So let me add a color value of white. White looks good when the colors are dark, when the background colors are dark. I'm going to save it, scroll down. Cool. I think our application is looking really nice now. It's coming up, right? So I can enter some value, I can click on add income button, or I can click on add expense button, and that's going to add the expenses here. And that is something, which is an interactivity, and we can't do it in HTML and CSS. For that, we need JavaScript. All right. So let me see once again if everything looks good. This expense tracker is at the center, and this is on the left. But I think this font is not looking good. Maybe this expense tracker and this your balance. So let me try to change that font a bit. Maybe this your balance is much bigger than this one. So I think I need to target the H2, and I need to change its font size to something like 1.2 em probably. Let's try this. This is looking much better. It should have some spacing between these, right? So let's target these elements like transaction history. Do I have a transaction history element here? So let me see. I have a cash flow container, which is this one. I have an income container. I have expense container. I have transaction, right? So let me add some margin top here, maybe 20 pixel, just to add some spacing. Nope. So what is transaction? Basically Oh, it's ID UL. Actually, I need to target this container actually. So I'm going to copy this. Do I have an element for that? If not, I'm going to add it. And let me put this margin top from here to here. Save. Maybe I'll go with 40. That will look good. Cool. Now we have some spacing here. And next I need to add, for this also add new transaction. So what's the element for that? Add new transaction. I have a form container for that. So I'm going to use this form container. Do I have a form container? Right, I have a form container. So I'm going to put some margin here. Margin top of same value, 40 pixel. I can create a variable for that if I want. This is looking good. So I have my your balance, transaction history, and add new transaction, name, amount, add income, add expense. This is looking much better. Let's see if I expand and make it small. Cool. So HTML and CSS is done. Now let's see how we can add new transaction into this transaction history. How can we update these values, right? And all of that can be done with the use of our magical tool, magical language called JavaScript. So let's jump into the JavaScript from the next video. Hello. So we are good with HTML and CSS for our expense tracker application. Now let's add some JavaScript to our application to make it more interactive. So to add JavaScript, obviously we need to create a script file, and this time I'm going to create a script block just before my body element. And I'm not going to write the inline CSS because this program is going to get bigger. So it's a good idea to have an external script file. So I'm going to refer to the external script file using the source property, and we are going to write index.js. I'm going to save it, and let's create a new file called index.js, and this will be our JavaScript file. Cool. So first things first, I'm going to create the state of my application. So we are going to define the state of this application first. Now what's the state of an application? State is nothing but data which is going to change. So if you look at our expense tracker application, this balance, this is going to change, right? This income, this expense, this transaction history, all of this is a state of our application. Because whenever I'm going to add a new value using this name and amount field, maybe I'll add income, I'll add expense, this transaction history is going to change. And when this transaction history is going to change, this income value and this expense value is going to change. And finally, this balance is going to change. So the things or the data which changes, we call it state of our application. And this application is small, right? This expense tracker, this is just a single page application. I don't have all of those navigations. If I click on any of the link, it's opening the second or third, another page, I would say. It's not happening here. So when we are going to have multiple pages, we might need to take a different approach for creating the state. But for this simple application, creating a state variable or object would be really easy. So I'm going to use an object. I'm going to create a simple variable called state. I'm going to call it state, and this will be state of my application. And obviously I'm going to use object for that. See, I can create different variables for my state. Like for this balance, I can create a balance, and maybe I can add some value here. I can create another variable for income, right? Maybe 2000, something like this. But it's always a good idea to have state as an object. Having all these variables, it's not going to help in the long run, because later on I'm going to save this state into local storage. And we are going to talk about that in the upcoming video. So don't worry about it. Just remember, whenever you want to create a state, the first choice would be using an object. And we know how to create object in JavaScript. Objects are all about name and value. So let's start from top to bottom and define the state. So right, what's this state? This state is all about, all the hard-coded values which I have used here. This balance, this is hard-coded, this is hard-coded, this is also hard-coded. And all of this transactions, this is also hard-coded. Now I'm going to replace it with a state using JavaScript. So let's create the state first. So I've defined a variable state, which is going to be object. First variable or first value inside my state would be balance, and my balance is $1,000. Next, income. So you just need to refer your HTML file, this output, right? Income would be 1,200. Then I have some expenses. So I'll define expense variable, give it a value of 200. Then I have this transaction history. Now look at this. What kind of data type we are going to use here? Can you guess the data type, or how we are going to put this list, right? Or how we are going to put this data into variable? Which kind of data it is? Is it object or is it something else? So whenever we have a list, right? Whenever we have something which is in numbers, right? Multiple items, we use array, right? So I'm going to put all my transactions in a transactions array, right? And even this transaction array is going to have object, because I have multiple values here, right? This salary, this amount, right? So I should have a container. I can't create different variables for it. So this transactions array is going to have objects. So first object with the property called name. So what's the transaction name? Is it a salary? Is it a buy grocery, right? Is it buy guitar? So I'm going to store that in a name property. So first, I'm going to go with the salary, right? Next, this amount, right? How much money or how much amount I have spent, or how much salary I got. So I'm going to create amount only. And I'm going to put that value like 5,000. Now I need to define the type of this transaction, whether it is an income or expense. That's how, I'm going to color it, right? With a green color or with a red color. And based on those values, I can do some calculations, right? So I'm going to define one more property called type. And the first one will be income, right? Because it's green. So I'm going to use income. Now I need to create these objects, right? Two more objects. I'm just going to copy this one, first one. And I just need to change these values. So second will be buy grocery. Amount is like $50. And this is expense. This is an expense. Let's have one more object created. This time it will be by guitar. So GUIT, guitar. Amount would be $500. And this is again an expense. See that? I got all of my transactions in an array, and each transaction is actually an object. Cool. So this is looking good. Now next, let me scan my application. Let me see if I have anything else related to state. I think this is it. This should be good for my state of an application. This looks good. So I've created a state object with balance, income, expense, transactions. I'm going to save. Nothing is going to happen. Now we are going to use this state to render the initial state of my application. I mean, all these initial values right now, they're hard coded, right? All of these numbers are hard coded in my HTML. Now I'm going to use JavaScript and this state object to render all of these values, right? Using the state object. Hello, we are good with our state. We have defined the state of our application in the last video, but all of these values, they are hard coded in the HTML file. So now I'm going to target all of these HTML elements in JavaScript, and I'm going to populate all of these values using the state object. So let's do that. So for that, I'm going to write a function I'm going to create an init function and I'm going to straight away call it. And just for the testing purpose, first let me console.log init just to see whether this function is getting called or not. So I'm going to open my dev tool, go to the console. Cool. So init is getting called. Next, let's target elements one by one. First of all, I'm going to target this your balance div, this $1,000, and I'm going to replace this with this value. So I'm going to change these values for now. Maybe I'll go with 0 for time being. Okay. So let's start and let's target this element first. So where is this element? So this element is having an ID of balance. So I'm going to target this. I'm going to create all of these variables here in the global scope just to refer them, throughout the application. So I'm going to use, this will be my balance element, and I'm going to use document.query selector, and I'm going to use ID selector, and I know the ID of this is balance. So I'm going to get my balance element. Next, I'm going to target this balance element and I'm going to use its inner HTML property, and I'm going to assign this balance property here. But this time I'm going to use a new syntax called backticks. So these backticks are called template literal or a string literal, I would say. This is a really nice feature of JavaScript where, I can combine string with JavaScript variables. I just want to give you one example here. So let me create a name variable here. So I'm going to create a name variable with, say, John, and I'm going to console.log your name is, and then name. So now if I save this, see that your name is John. I got this output here. So what I did, I would have done this using something called plus operator to combine two strings together. So I'm combining a string with a variable, which is a string variable, right? And if I save, I'm getting this output. But we can do this using string literals or a template literal syntax. So for that, I just need to do something like this. I need to use a special syntax in JavaScript called backticks. And then I can use string your name is, okay. And I don't need to use this plus operator. Instead of that, I can do that inside this backticks. So to refer the variables of JavaScript inside this template literal syntax, I can use a $sign and then do two curly brackets. Now I can write any variable here, right? Say suppose I want to refer this name variable here, I can write name, and now if I save, see that I got the same output. Maybe I'll try to change the name to Linda and save this one. See, we got your name is Linda. So this is this syntax I'm going to use so many times in this program while writing this program. So this is called a template literal or a string literal syntax. Now I'm going to use that. So I want this balance, your balance, right, to be, so I'm going to combine it with $, and then again I'm going to use a $, and now I'm going to refer this state.balance variable here. So I'm going to target state.balance, and now you'll see the magic. See that? Initially this value was $1,000, which is hard coded in my HTML, got changed to my state value. Now say suppose I change the state to 100, and if I save, see that? Now it's coming from the JavaScript. We are going to do the same with this income and expense HTML elements. So obviously I need to target them. So I'm going to create another variable. So I'll write a variable and I'm going to target my income element, document.query selector, and I'm going to use ID syntax. I'm going to target the income. Let me check if it's income. Yes, it's income. So I'm good with that. I'm going to copy this. Let's populate it. Let's change the inner HTML to, again, I'm going to use backtick syntax. I'm going to add dollar because I don't have dollar here, right? That's why I'm using this dollar string, then again dollar for referring my variables. And this time I'm going to refer state dot income semicolon, save. See that? 1200. Let me change it to something else, 400, and save. See that? Similarly, let's target this expense element. So first of all, I'm going to copy this part. So I'm going to call it expense element, document.query selector expense, and I'm going to use my expense element dot inner HTML backticks dollar state dot expense. If I save, let me change this value to something else, maybe 100. And if I save, see that? Cool. So we are going good. Now let's target this transaction history. Now this is an array, right? All of these transactions are array, and we know how to loop through an array using for loop, right? So we need to loop through this transaction array. We need to take each of this object and we need to generate all of this HTML structure. So I'm going to keep this HTML structure aside for now so that I can refer it. And let me remove all of this LIs from here because I don't need it. I'm going to add it through JavaScript. So I'm going to save this one. So you see that I don't have anything here, right? Transaction history is empty. Now I'm going to target this element, this UL element, right? Which has a ID of transaction. So let's first create that variable. So that will be my transactions element, and I'm going to target document.query selector, and with the ID only I'm going to target transaction. Was it transaction or transactions? It's transaction. Okay, so I'm going to refer transaction only. Let's save it. So this is my UL. Now the fun part, right? We need to generate the HTML using JavaScript for each of these transactions. So basically I need to create different li element with, that structure, that div, span and button structure. So I'll be going step by step. Let's first create the parent element. So I'm going to create a new li element. So I'm going to call it li, or maybe I'll call it transaction element because each transaction is like a transaction for me. So I'm going to use document.create element function, and I'm going to create the li element. Okay, and we need to create this element inside a for loop actually. So let's write a for loop. So I'm going to write for variable I is equals to 0, I less than transaction. Now I need to refer my state.transactions dot length. So I need to loop through all of these transactions. So this transaction is nothing but value or a property of this state, right? State.transactions. So I'm referring state.transactions.length, then I plus plus, and inside this I need to create all those li element. So basically I'm going to refer this transaction element and I'm going to create those li's inside here. So I'll keep this variable outside, right? And I'm going to create it. This li element I'm going to create inside this for loop. Now we have the li element. Next, let's append this li element directly to our transactions element. Okay, so I'm going to use append child method, and I'm going to append this transaction element. So let's append some string also just to see, what's going on here. So I'm going to use my transaction element and I'm going to use append function, not append child, to append the string. And we can get this string. How can we get this string from this transactions, right? So I'm going to refer state.transactions, something like this, state.transactions, okay, 0. So I'm going to refer the I actually, not 0, I. So, for first time when the I is 0, I'm going to get this object. When I will be 1, I'm going to get this object. When I will be 2, I'm going to get this object. So I'm referring state transaction I dot name. See that? So basically, I'm taking this string value, this name, and I'm adding that to this particular li element which I have created. This is a text node, right, of this li element. And then I'm appending that transaction element to the transactions element, which is my UL. This part. So what I did, I've created that li and I have added that li to this UL element. So now if I save, we should see that added here. See that? And all the styles are applied, right? Because we have already written the CSS for it. So I got the salary, by grocery, by guitar, but we don't have those boxes. But we don't have that amount value, right? And that close button. So we need to create that, right? So let's create a container for the span element and the button element. Okay, so I'm going to show that HTML to you. I'm going to add that HTML here at the end of the script block, just for the reference, So we need to create this div, then this span, and then this button. So what I'm going to do, first I'm going to create this div. So we know how to create div element, right? So let me create a new variable. Instead of defining this variable here, I'm going to define this variable outside. So I'm going to call it container element. So I'm going to create that container element is equals to document dot create element, and this time I'm going to create a div element, right? So this is my div. Inside that div, I want to have this span, right? So let's create this span element. So I'm going to call it, amount element. Amount element. So let's create the amount element first. Document dot create element using the span. So this is my amount element, and it has a class name of income amount, right? So we need to add that class, and we need to add this text also. So let's first add the class. So I'm going to target the amount element dot class list. This is a property of this particular object, right? And we have an add method. This is object class list. So it has properties and method. We have an add method, and I'm going to add a class of income amount. But we need to identify whether this particular transaction is income or expense, right? And how can we identify that? By looking into this object. So, I have created this type property. So based on type, this class is going to change. It can be income amount or it can be expense amount. If you remember when we have created the initial structure of the application, right? So I'm going to put some condition here, right? So I'm going to check for if. So, this state transaction this I'm going to refer more number of time. So the better way, is to create a variable for that, right? So I'm going to create a variable. So maybe I'll create a variable called transaction, or, I'll create an item variable here, and I'm going to store it into item, something like this. Save, right? And instead of using state.transaction I'm going to refer it by item. Cool, right? Now I'm going to refer that item once again here, and I need to check for item.type. If item.type is equals to income, do this, take this. And when the value is income, I need to add a class of income amount, right? AMT. Else, I'm going to check for another condition. This will be good idea to check again, if the value is expense, then I'm going to copy this one and paste it here. That will be expense amount. Cool. So I got my classes in place. I got the amount element span created with the class value. What's next? Next, I need to have this text, right? And from where I'm going to get this text? I'm going to get this text from here. This is my amount, right? So I'm going to refer this property of my transaction. So to add that, I'm going to use my amount element, and I'm going to refer its inner HTML property, and I'm going to add that amount item. I'm going to use backticks actually. So this will be dollar and then again dollar, and I need to refer item dot amount because each of my transaction has amount property, right? So I'm referring this property only. So amount element dot inner HTML item dot amount semicolon. So we are done with this part also. So I have populated, or I have created entire span element using JavaScript HTML functions, right? So using JavaScript DOM API, I would say. So this is done. Next, we need to create this button. So let me first append this span to my div element, this container element. So now I'm going to call container element dot append child, and I'm going to append my amount element. You'll see the difference here when I'm going to save. Nothing is happening. What's wrong? So I'm using my container element div and append child amount element, which is a span. So let me try to console.log. What's the value of my amount element? So I'm going to save this one. I'm getting the right span element, but somehow it's not getting. Okay, I think the program is working fine. I have created the container element div, right? And then I have created amount element, and I have append that amount element to container element, but I didn't append the container element to the transaction element, right? This element. So I need to append this container element, append child, to transaction element, each individual transaction, So I'm going to append this. And now if I save, see that? We got the values. Now what's remaining? We need to add this button, and we are going to add this button in a similar fashion like how we have added this container element, right? This amount element, how we have created this span and added the container element. So let's create the button. So before doing that, this amount element, I'm going to create the button element. So let's create a new variable outside only. So I'm going to call it button element, and let's create a button element using document dot create element. This time I'm going to create a button, and this button element is going to have an inner HTML of this X value. Save. Now I'm going to append this button element to the container element, that div, right? This div. This is my container element. So I'm going to append container element dot append child, and append this button. So button element. Now if I save, we got the button also, but we don't have the style in place. Why? So we basically need some spacing here on the right hand side and it's not coming here. So I need to refer my CSS, and this is my span element. Maybe I need to add some margin, right? Let me try this, maybe a 5 pixel. Let's see how it goes. Cool. I think now this is looking good. So we are good with our CSS. Come back to JavaScript. You see that we have populated all the transactions from this array, So let me remove this just to show you, I'm going to Control X, save. I don't have the transactions. I'm going to undo and save. We got all the transactions, right? So we are done with balance, income, expense, and all the transaction, right? So entire state of our application, and I don't want this actually. So let me remove this part from my main HTML file. See that we have used our initial state, right, of the application. Now these are all hard-coded values. We are not going to have this one. We are going to really start from the scratch, and even we are going to save this state later on, right? So now I have used all of this state variables, all of this data, and I have rendered entire application state using JavaScript. See that we have written so much of JavaScript. We have written nice JavaScript code here, and we have made our application dynamic now. Now we don't have all of these hard-coded values. We had it initially, but now we have used state and we have used all the DOM API, to populate all of these values. So we are going good. I think our application's initial state is in place. Next, we are going to target this part, this top part of the application where we are going to do calculation, based on these values. We are going to populate how much balance I have, how much income. So I'm going to add the income values, I'm going to add the expense values, and I'm going to populate all of these values through those calculations in the next video. Hello. Now in this video, we are going to calculate the expenses. This balance, income, and expense value. This actually depends on the transaction. So if I don't have any transaction, I'm not going to have a balance, income, or expense. So basically we need to do calculations around these transactions. So when I have the transaction, based on this transaction, I'm going to calculate the balance, income, and expense. So let's do that in this video. So first of all, I'm going to remove all of this code. So I'm going to move all of this code, I'm going to move all of this code into that function called a render function. So let me write that render function first. And I'm going to cut this code from here, entire code. I'm going to cut it and I'm going to paste. I think I need that last, this one also. And I'm going to paste it inside my render function. And I'm going to call that render function here, something like this. I'm going to save and everything is working fine. Just to see, I'm going to change it to 1000, save. See that? It's working fine. Now, I have refactored my code a bit. We have the initial render inside a render function. Now let's do the calculation around my transactions. So for that, I'm going to create a function called update state, because based on this transaction, I need to update my state. So that's what I'm going to do inside my update state function. And once the state is updated, I'm going to call the render function. So let me write function update state, and inside this update state, I'm going to loop through all of these transactions to populate these values. Okay, so I'm going to write a for loop, variable I is equals to 0. I need to access state.transactions.length, and I need to create different variables here. So I'm going to create all those variables. So I'm going to create one variable called balance to store balance. that will be 0. I'm going to create one more variable, or maybe I can use comma separated syntax here. Income will be 0 and expense will be 0. So I'm going to access different transactions, and I'm going to update this balance, income and expense variables. So I'm going to create a new variable, maybe outside here only, just to have an item, I'm going to refer individual item using this variable. So let's have an item is equals to state dot transactions and then I. So this will give me the item, and I'm going to have a condition here. So I'm going to check whether my transaction, whether my item dot type, if type is equals to income, right? So I need to do all of those calculations, I need to write all of that logic. So I'm going to check if the type is income, I'm going to add it to income. If the type is expense, I'm going to add it to expense. And based on that, I'm going to calculate the balance. Let me change it to 1000 for now. And now, if the type is income, I'm going to increment my income value. So income plus equals to this income, right? Item dot amount. Okay, else I'm going to check for if the item type is expense, I'm going to increment my expense value. So expense plus equals to item dot amount. See that? See that? It's really easy, right? And finally, I need to calculate my balance, right? So I have looped through it. Now I got the income value, I got the expense value. Let's first, console.log and see what values I'm getting. So I'm going to log my balance. I didn't calculate the balance yet, but let's see what is the income and what is the expense. So now if I open my console, if I save my program, see that we got 0, my income is 1000 and my expense is 550 because I got two expense item here. One is 50 and it's calculating well. Now to have a balance, I just need to subtract expense from the income, right? So I'm going to create a balance. So I need to write balance equals to income minus expense, right? And that's how I'm going to get my balance. So I got 450 as a balance, 1000 was my income and 550 as my expense. Now I'm going to use all of these variables which I have created, and I'm going to update my state because based on transaction, my state is going to change. So let's change the state values. So I'm going to target state dot balance is equals to balance, state dot income is equals to income, and state dot expense is equals to expense. Cool. So my state is updated now, and you'll see these values will be updated based on my state. So I'm going to, because first of all, I have called this update state function. Once the state is updated, I'm going to render my user interface or my application with that new state. So I'm going to close this one and I'm going to save. See that? Income is 1000, expense is 550, and your balance is 450. This looks good. I think I did the calculation well. This is simple mathematics and simple logic, and I have just written the state logic inside that update function. This is beauty of writing functions, Here I am not accessing any of the DOM element. This is a pure function which I have created or I have written for state manipulation. That's why, this state I have created and I'm updating that state doing some calculations here, and then finally I'm calling the render function to render that state, because later on, I'm going to delete these transactions. I'm going to add new transactions here, and once I'm going to do that, I'm going to update the state only, and once the state is updated, I'm going to render my UI once again. Now this is a small application, so I have one state variable. Even you can divide your state into different parts, like for this one you can have one state, for this one you can have another state variable. But this application is simple, this is small, that's why I have created one state variable, and once the state is getting updated, I'm rendering the UI. So for such a small application, I think this approach has no problem. I think so. So there are different ways of writing code. This is one way, which I am following, which I feel is good. So I'm using this particular methodology here. So I think we are good with our calculation of expenses using the transaction. I'm able to populate my balance, income, and expense, and my transactions are rendering. My transaction history is rendering fine using this transactions array. So this looks good. We are done with our calculating expenses. Let's move on to next video, and in that video we are going to talk about adding and deleting expenses. When I click on this delete button, I need to remove this transaction, and when I add some name and amount here, and if I click on add income, add expense, it should get added here and my state should get updated. This income and expense and balance, right? So let's do that in the next video. Hello. In this video, we are going to see how we can add a new transaction. So suppose I enter some name and amount here, and then if I click on add income or add expense button, this particular transaction should get added in my transaction history. And based on that new record, my balance, income, and expense area should get updated. And similarly, if I click on this delete button, this particular transaction record should get deleted. And based on that, this should get updated, this balance area, income, and expense. So let's start small. Let's take a first step. And first we are going to see how we can add this name and amount by clicking on add income or add expense button. So first things first, I think I need to listen for add income. I need to listen for a click event on both of these buttons. So first we need to target these buttons and we need to listen for the click event. So let's target these buttons first. Before targeting, I need to query the buttons. I need to access the buttons. So let's go back to our HTML file and let's see what's the name of this button. So income button, expense button. So I'm going to target income button element, and I'm going to say document.query selector, and I'm going to use ID selector, and let's target income button. Next we have expense button. So expense button element, document.query selector, ID selector, and expense btn. Now I have the button. Now I need to listen for click event on both of these buttons. So I'm going to add a function here. When I'm going to initialize my application, I'm going to initialize my event listeners. So I'm going to write a new function called init listeners. So I need to write this function here. So function init listeners, function init listeners, and inside this function I'm going to listen for the click event on both of these buttons. So first I'm going to target income button. First I'm going to target income button element dot we know we have a function called add event listener, and I want to listen for a click event, and on click of this I'll call a function. So on add income click. Okay, and next I'm going to target expense button element dot add event listener. Similarly, I'm going to listen for a click event here, and I'm going to call on add expense click. Now let's write these functions. So first one will be function on add income click, and I'm going to console.log just for the testing purpose. This I'm going to call income. Next function will be function on add expense click. I'm going to log console.log. This will be expense. Let's save, and I'm going to test my program. So I'm going to click on inspect. I'm going to open console, and so I have opened my console window. My program is saved. Let me refresh once again, and this time I'm going to click on, I'm not going to enter anything. We are just testing whether these buttons are working or not. So I'm going to click on add income. Cool, I got the income and then it got refreshed. And this is refreshing because of this form. So first of all, I need to correct this form. So on this form, there is an event called on submit. So on this submit, I'm going to return a false just to stop from refreshing my page. Now if I go and click here, add income, we are getting income, add expense, we are getting the expense. Cool. So the program is working fine. So the application is working fine. Let's move on and see how we can add a new transaction by collecting values from the name input and the amount input. So first of all, I need to target these elements, this name input and amount input. So let's target those elements. Name input element is equals to document dot query selector. Let's see if I have given an ID. Yes, I have an ID for income button. I have an ID for amount actually. So I'm going to use name and amount. So name and amount I'm going to target using ID selector. So first name, then I'll create another variable for amount, input element, again document dot query selector, and this time I'm going to target amount. So let's test the program till now. So when I click on income, let me see if I get any output. Like I'm going to target name input element dot value, and not value actually, name input element dot value and amount input element dot value. I'm going to test it for income, test for this function only. I think it should work fine for the expense also. So I'm going to enter something, maybe I'll put some test data and I'll put 200, and if I click on add income, see that getting income test 200. Now I need to take these values from here and I need to create the transaction record similar to this, right? So we have this object, right? This is our transaction data. So I'm getting the name, right? So if I come back here, I'm getting this name, right? This name, then amount, and I'm the type also, right? So I can get that type from the button. So if I click on add income button, the type will be income. If I click on add expense button, the type will be expense. So let's create this object. So I'm going to copy this from here. So when I click on add income, click function, inside that I'm going to create this object, and I can create that object something like this. So I'm going to create a variable and I'm going to call it transaction and paste here. So this name I'm going to get from here. So I'm going to target my name input element dot value. Let me put enter here just for the readability of the code. And for the amount, how I'm going to get amount, I need to target amount input element dot value. Now this is going to be string actually, so I need to convert it into a number. So I'm going to use parse it int function of JavaScript, and I'll convert this into number. Type will be, in this case, I know this is income because I've clicked on add income, click. So let me remove this console. We have created our transaction object here, right? See my program, I don't see any error. Now I have my transaction data created. I need to push this data, right? Because this is a new record which I need to add, and where I need to add, I need to update my state actually. So I need to add a new record or data into this transactions array, right? So to do that, I'm going to access my state transactions, and I'm going to use push function, and I'm going to push my transaction into it, right? So once the new record has been added into this transaction, I need to update my state, right? So once the record is added here, I need to update my state. So I already have a function for updating the state. So I'm going to call the update state function. Okay. So let's call our update state function, and which will take care of everything else, because anyways it is going to loop through the transactions, it is going to check for the type, and it is going to calculate the income and expenses. So let's call update state function after adding the transaction record. Okay. And let's see, when I call update state, it's going to call this update state function. But after updating the state, I need to render my UI also. So if I do something, so if I save my program now, and if I want to test it, let me close this one and say suppose, I'll refresh once again. Say suppose I want to add some cash, and I got, say suppose $500 cash. Now if I click on add income button, nothing is happening, right? But I can log my state actually. So let me refresh, and after adding this transaction, I can console .log my state. Let's see what we get here. So I'm going to add some data, maybe cash, and cash will be like $500. So if I click on add income button, before that I'm going to open my console, and I'm going to click on add income, see the new state. So in transaction, you see I got the fourth record of cash with amount of 500 and type is income. But a UI is not updated because I didn't call the render function. So let's do some changes in our program. So in the update state only, after the state has been updated, I'm going to call the render function. See that? So I don't need this render function here because when I'm updating the state, I'm calling the render function. So let's remove it from here, save the program. Let's add cache entry, and I'm going to add a cache of $1,000. Now look at this area. I'm going to add income. See that? Something strange happened. I see the output actually salary 1,000 by grocery, by guitar. Salary has came here, that record has been added, but something is repeating, right? Because I'm not clearing the old transaction history. I have my state in correct state. I have my state. I have valid data in my state, but this rendering is not getting clear. This rendering is not getting cleared before I render new data. So let's go back to our render function because I have a problem in my render function only. So basically, I need to clear this UL whenever I'm going to render my transactions, right? So I need to clear my transaction element basically. So if I come back to my HTML and I need to clear this transaction actually. So basically, I need to clean up this transaction element. Let me see if I'm targeting this transaction element somewhere at the top. Yes, this transaction ID, this is the ID of this UL element, right? So I need to clean it up like how it is at the start. So this transaction I'm already targeting here, transactions element. So I need to use this variable and I need to clear the inner HTML before I start looping and adding new transactions into it. So I'm going to add one line here. So transactions, this is transaction, this is transactions element dot inner HTML is equals to blank. So once I clear the transaction element inner HTML, then I can loop, I can create the new li elements here and I can append all those li element into the transactions element. You see here, transactions element, transaction element. So now if I save, it's working fine. Now let me try to add new transaction, maybe $1,000. Now look at this area and this area also, everything should work fine. Now if I click on add income, see that? I got $1,000 added as a cash. That's my income. Income got updated by $2,000 and my balance got updated by $1,450. Cool. So our add new transaction is working fine, but there is a problem here. If I don't enter anything here and if I click on it, it is going to add a blank transaction here. So we need to handle that part. So let's put some validation in our code. So I'll show you what's going to happen. So if I remove this and if I click on add income, see that? We are adding the blank transaction here. So to avoid this, we need to have some validation in our code. So before adding any transaction, add income or anything, I'm going to check for the values, right? So this name input value and this amount input value, I need to check this. So it's a good idea to put them into a variable, right? So I'm going to create some variables here like name, and I'll store that value into that name. Then variable amount is equals to, I'm going to copy this from here, paste it here. This is amount value. So I'm going to check if name is not equals to blank and amount is not equals to blank. So both the values should be there. Then only we are going to add the transaction, then we are going to create the variable transactions. I'm going to cut it from here, paste it here, and then I'm going to do all of these things, like update the state and push the transaction. Else we are going to show an alert to user, please enter valid data, something like this. So now if I save my program and if I click on add income, see that it's not adding the new record here, it's giving me an error, please enter valid data. So this is working fine. Let's try to add something just for the testing purpose. 1000 add income, this is working fine. Cool. Now I need to work on add expense also, and just work on add income. So we have a function for that, on add expense click. So the code will be very much similar to this one, you know. So I need to just copy this part exactly and paste it here. So this is a duplicate code, right? So whenever you're copying and pasting some part of a code, you are actually creating a technical debt, and duplicate code is one of the tech debt. So you shouldn't write duplicate code. That is a really important rule of any programming language. Your code should be dry. Dry means do not repeat yourself. So this is really important programming principle which you should remember. You shouldn't repeat yourself. So I think we are repeating a code. So let's refactor it. So basically I need to add a transaction of different type. One will be income type and second will be expense type. So let's see how I can refactor this code, you know. So maybe I can take out this code from here and I'll write a new function and I'll call it add transaction. Okay. And I'm going to paste that code here. So we just need to pass these values there, right? This name input and amount input value. So I'm going to pass all those values as an argument, name, amount, and I'm going to pass type also. And this function should take care of adding the transaction, right? So I'm just going to use this type here instead of income, hard coding this. I'm going to pass this type. So I'm going to call this add transaction method. And before calling this function add transaction, you know, I just need to make some changes here. So I'm going to pass name. I'm going to pass amount. So let's change this, and type is already there. Now let's call this function add transaction. I'm going to pass name input dot value, then amount input dot value, and in this case, as I have clicked on add income button, so the type will be income. So now if I save my program and let's try to add some income, so cash of 1000, if I click on add income, see that it's working fine. Now let's see how I can add expense. So I'm going to call same function add transaction, like how I have called here, and this time I don't need this duplicate code. You see the beauty of, you know, encapsulating the same function at one place. I'm not repeating my code now. So let's call add transaction, and I'm going to pass same argument like name input element dot value, amount input element dot value, and this time only argument which is going to change is expense. So this is expense, right? So now I'm going to save. This is add expense click. Let's try to add some expense, maybe buy piano, and it will cost me a lot of money actually, but I'll put some amount like $100. So buy piano 100 as an expense. If I click on add expense, see that 100, 650, right? It is in red color and I got 350 as a balance. So I think my expense tracker application is working fine. Looks good to me. So I'm able to add income, I'm able to add expense. But you know, one thing I see here, when I add any of these things, you know, I need to clear these values. So how can I do that? So after adding a transaction, probably, you know, we can clear those values. So after this add transaction, I can clean up those values. So I can target those element, name input element dot value is equals to blank, and amount input element dot value is equals to blank. Something like this I can do. Save. Say I'll add some cash, 1000, add income. See that? It's getting cleared now. Looks good. Now let's see how we can remove the transaction from here. So say I click on this delete button, you know, it should remove the transaction, and we can reuse some of our code only. So let's go back to index.html. I have everything inside this UL, and everything is happening here inside this render function. So inside this render, you know, I'm creating this button. Where is that button? This is the button element, right? So I just need to add event listener to this button. So I'm going to target this button element, add event listener. I'm going to listen for a click event, and on delete click will be the function I'm going to call. So let's write this function on delete click, and I'm going to write this function here, function on delete click. Let's see if it is getting called. So every function, you know, handler function gets something called event object. So I'm going to pass that event object as an argument, and let's try to console.log this event object. Okay, just to test our program. So I'm going to save. I'll open my console window and say suppose I click on buy grocery, nothing is going to happen now, but see that I'm getting that event object, and as this is an object, it has name and value, lots of names and values, and I am interested in this property called the target. The target is button, but we have a problem here, right? I'm deleting this buy grocery, but how will I know which record I'm deleting, right? So we should have some kind of, you know, identifier to identify some kind of value, unique value, which I can use to identify which record I'm deleting. And that value should be on the button element because target is button, right? So let's put some identifier on our transaction history records, you know. So I'm going to close this one, and I'm going to add some IDs to my transactions. So for this, you know, I'm going to use a random ID generator function. So let me write that function here only. So I'll write a function called unique ID, and this function is going to return me some unique ID. So I'm going to use a function called math.random, which is going to generate random numbers, and I'm going to multiply it with some big number like this, and let's see what we get as unique ID. So I'm going to put this unique ID function here, and I'll add some IDs to my records. So I'll call unique ID, comma, I'm going to copy this and paste it for all the records. So for this one and for this one also. Now I'm going to put this ID when I click on this delete button. I need to pass this ID so that I'll know, like ID. I need to know which record I have clicked, and I should have a way to grab this ID from that particular record. So I'm going to save my program. I'll go down and I'm going to put this ID on that button. So inside my render function, when I'm rendering all those transaction data, I'm going to put that ID on the button. So if you remember, our element has attributes also, right? So I'm going to target my button element and I'm going to set a new attribute on it. And this attribute will be data-id. Now this is a way of defining data on HTML element using data dash, the attribute name. And I know I'm going to get that ID from my transaction data because my transaction has the ID property, right? So I'm going to put that ID here, and that transaction element I'm already storing in some variable, maybe yes, it is in the item. So I'm going to refer this item and ID, right? So let's see, I'm going to log this ID, whether I'm getting this ID or not. When I click on this delete click button, I'm going to look for event.target. Okay, and I'm going to call. So let's keep event.target only. I'm going to save just to show you in the console window, like which properties that element has, that target element. So I'm going to click on this. I got the button, right? And you see that I'm getting the data ID. This ID is coming with some kind of, decimal number, because I need to put one more line of math.random. I should do math.round also. So we should have a whole number, I would say. Okay, so now if I click, see that? So now I need to grab this ID so that I can delete the record, right? So I'm going to go back to my delete function. I know event.target has attribute data-id. Like I have set the attribute using set attribute function. Similarly, we can get the attribute using get attribute function. So let me grab this ID here using event.target. So I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to grab the ID, event.target.get attribute, and I need an attribute called data-id. And now I'm going to loop through all of my transactions in my state. Variable I is equals to 0, I less than state dot transactions dot length I plus plus, and I'm going to check for if my transactions I dot id is equals to this ID which I have got from the target. I know I need to remove that particular data from the array, right? So to remove the element from the middle of the array or any position, which function we can use? We can use a function called splice, if you remember. So I'm going to use my splice function, but I'm going to use splice function not here. Actually here I'm going to collect the index only. So let's have one more variable defined here that will be start index probably. Okay, or delete index. I'm going to call it delete index. Okay, and I'm not going to store any value into it. And here I'm going to save the I value, that will be my delete index, and I'm going to break the loop because now I got the transaction which is matching with my ID. So finally I'm going to use this splice method. I'm going to use delete index, and I need to remove just one record. I'm going to use 1 as a count, right? So when I click on delete button, this function is going to get called. I'm getting the ID using data ID attribute. I'm looping through my transactions. I'm checking for the ID. If ID is matching, I'm collecting that index, storing that value into delete index, and finally I'm using the splice function to remove that particular transaction, right? So this will change my state, and I should call update state again so that my UI should re-render. That's how I'm handling all of my state and render part, right? So I'm going to save my program. Let's test it. So I'm going to remove this. So I have 1000 as an income, 550 as expense. I'm going to remove this buy grocery expense. That should subtract this 50 from 550. It should add 50 here. So this value should be 500 and this value should be 500. Okay, so I'm going to remove this. See that? But I got something different here. So there must be some problem with our code. Okay, so we got a problem here. I'm getting the minus 550 and something went wrong with my income also, right? So let's debug the program. So I'm going to tell you how to debug this. I'm going to add a debugger statement here. I'm going to save my program, and this time I'm going to open my console and I'm going to debug. So when I click on this, my program is going to stop here. I want to see like what's going on here, why it is happening. So I'm going to click on this button. You see this? My program has been paused, and it has paused at this line 67. So let's debug the code here. So I see I got state transaction. I got all the transaction with ID, and I have what is my ID? My ID is 757891. And here also I have 757891. I got both the IDs and I got it right. If you look at here, this ID is a number, and when I go and when I hover over this ID, this is a string. So we are comparing number with a string. So this is a problem. So let me see, it's not going into that delete index line, right? Second time, third time, it's directly coming out. So we are getting delete index value as undefined. That's why, our program is not working, because this ID is a string and this one is a number. So I need to convert this ID. So when I use this get attribute function, it returns me a string. That's a good catch. So let me convert that ID number. So I just need to do one change. I just need to write a parse int function here. So I'm going to use parse int function of JavaScript to convert this string into a number, and this should work fine. I don't need debugger statement here. I'm going to save my program, delete. See that? Oh, I didn't get delete actually. So I'm going to click again. Now it's working fine. Expense 500, balance 500. Cool. Now there is one more thing I need to do here. When I'm adding a new transaction, just go back to, just remember, when we were adding a transaction, there is that function, adding a transaction. We are not adding the ID here. So this is going to create problem when I'm going to add a transaction here, because initially when we had a data, I had put the IDs for all the transaction data, but when I am adding a new transaction, I am not putting the ID. So let's put that ID here. So everything should work fine. I'll use unique ID function and this looks good. So let's test our program once again. Say suppose I delete this 500. Let's add one more transaction. Say suppose buy piano. I will spend around $100. I'm going to add it as an expense. See that 600, 400. Let me add some more cash, maybe $500. So I should get 500 plus 400, 900, and this should be 1500. So let me try that. Right, 1500, 500, and this one is 900. Cool. My expense tracker application is working fine till now. I'm able to add transaction, income, expense. I'm able to delete. So let's try deleting something. Maybe I'll delete this buy piano 100. That should go back to 500. So let's try to that. Yes, and I got $100 back. This is 1000. So looks good. Now everything looks fine, you know. If I refresh my application, what happens? It goes back to the initial state, right? So when I'm going to start my expense tracker application, I'm not going to have all of this transaction, right? So let me remove all of these transactions from here. Save. I don't have anything, right? So I need to start from scratch. Say suppose I got the salary of $5,000. I will add it as an income. Okay, I don't have any expenses. Say suppose I go ahead and buy piano of $500. I'll add it as an expense. So you see that for 4,500, 5,500. Now if I refresh my application, I get back to the initial state. So we need some way of saving this data, right? Whatever data I'm adding, say suppose I come back to my application, I should have that data stored somewhere. And we are going to use local storage of JavaScript for that. And that part we are going to finish in the next video. Hey everyone, so our expense tracker application is working fine. You know, I can add some cash, say suppose $1,000. If I add it as income, it's coming here. But you know, when I refresh my program, I'm coming back to the same state where, you know, everything goes back to zero. So my application is getting reset, right? So we need some way to store our state, all of this data of my program, of my expense tracker application, right? And how can we do that? So for that, you know, in JavaScript, we have an object called local storage. So there is an object called local storage, which is available in JavaScript. Now this is an object, and if I try to log this object here, you know, right now I don't have anything in my storage. And you can access all of this storage if you go to application tab, and if you expand this local storage, see, I don't have anything, no key value here. So basically you can think of this local storage as a cookie or some storage area in the browser where, you know, we can store the data. So I'm going to use this local storage for storing our state, all of these values into this local storage. So let's use this local storage object, and as it is an object, it has some functions which I'm going to use. So let me close my console and let's start. So whenever I'm updating my state, so this is beauty of function, you know, I have written a function called update state where I'm maintaining all of my state values, right? Everything is in my state. So whenever I'm updating my state, before rendering, you know, I'm going to save the state into local storage. For that, I'm going to use local storage object, which is standard built-in object of JavaScript. Okay. And I'm going to call its function called set item. So there is a function called set item using which I can store the values. So this set item takes 2 arguments. First one will be name of the item. So I'm going to name it expense tracker state. Okay, and this is like the name of that particular item or data which I'm going to save. And which data I want to save? I want to save my state. So instead of passing an object, I'm going to convert this state object into a string, which we called a JSON string. So to convert an object to JSON string, we use JSON. This is again inbuilt object of JavaScript dot stringify function. So what this stringify function basically does, this JSON object dot stringify function takes an object and converts into a string. So I'm going to convert my state into string, and that string value is going to get stored into my local storage into a key called expense tracker state. Okay, so now I'm going to save my program, and now let's expand this. I'm going to open the console window, and in the application you see that we got expense tracker state, right? And we got 0, 0, 0, everything is 0, and I don't have any transaction now. I'm going to update my data. Let's add some transactions. So I'm going to add a salary element of, say, suppose $5,000. And now when I add income, just look at this part, when I'm going to add this income, see that all of that data is getting saved because of clicking on this add income button in our program. We are updating the state, and that state is now getting stored into this property expense tracker state as a string value. If you see here, right, this is a string. Now we are saving the state, but how I can retrieve the state, right? So say suppose I refresh the program, I'm coming back to the similar state, right? 0, 0, 0, everything. Now because I have saved my state, but I need to retrieve my state, right? So like local storage has set item method, we have a method called get item. So I'm going to use that get item method at the beginning of my program when I'm initializing my application, right? Before updating the state, I'm going to retrieve the state and I'm going to assign that state to the state value. So I'm going to create a new local variable called state, or I'll call it local state. I'm going to use local storage dot get item, and I need expense tracker state. So this is the name I have used while saving the state. Let me check once again in my update state method. So expense tracker state, I'm going to use same value here. So let me copy and paste just to avoid any mistake. So this is going to return me the local state. Okay, and this will return me a string value. So I need to convert this into an object. So while saving, I have converted this object into string. Similarly, we are going to use JSON.parse method to convert string to an object. So I'm going to use JSON.parse and some brackets. So this is going to return me a local state object. Next, I'm going to check whether I have a state or not. So I'm going to add an if statement here where I'm going to check if local state is not equals to null, then I'm going to assign it to my state. I'm going to assign it to my state. So this looks good. I'm going to save my program. And now let's test our application throughout. So initially I'm having 0, 0, 0. Let me add new transaction of salary. Say suppose I got a salary of $5,000 add income. This is working fine. I'm going to open my console also, and let's see. I don't have any error here. So 5,000, 5,000, 0. Let me go and buy piano, or maybe I'll go with the grocery first. So I'll add some grocery item as an expense, maybe $500 grocery, and I'm going to add it as an expense. So we got 100 here, and expense is 100, and you see that 4,900. Let's try to add some cash, some more cash. Maybe I got $500 cash, and I'm going to add it as an income. So we got a new row here, new data, cash 500, income increased to 5,500, and we got 5,400 now. Let me add one more expense of $500 for the piano, and I'm going to add it as an expense. We got a new record, 500, expense increased to 600, and I got 4,900 now. Let me try to delete something, maybe a grocery item. So I'm going to delete this. Expense should change to 500. So let's remove 500, and income should increase. That balance is 5,000 now. So I think things are working fine. Let me try to refresh my program, and I don't see any error in the console. Everything looks good. Let me try to remove everything from here, and if I go back, I see everything is 0. If I refresh now, cool. I think our program is working fine. I've tested multiple scenarios. You can also test this program, and you can tell me if you find any bug or issue in this program, because I just tested it for 2 minutes and this doesn't look like a right testing. I need to test it in a different scenarios. Then only that testing will be the real testing, I would say. So I think we have written a lot of JavaScript, a lot of vanilla JavaScript to create this program, this expense tracker application. And there are multiple ways of writing one program. I'm not saying this is perfect code. The code which we write for the first time is not at all a good code, I would say. So there are definitely scope of improvement in this code. So there is something called a refactor phase which we have when we write any application. So we write the application for the first time, then we refactor, and we see what kind of improvement we can do in that refactor phase. So maybe when you're going to write your application for the third time, you will feel like, okay, now my code looks good to me, but you won't be satisfied. You won't be satisfied at that time also. That's a possibility. So there are multiple ways of writing code. As I said, you can check the expense tracker application, which has been written by some other developers on the Google. Take some inspirations from them. I have written this code keeping beginners in my mind, so that beginners should understand. But there are some of the things like json.parse and json.stringify I have used here, which are like maybe new for the beginners, but I think they're easy to understand. So even this render function, I see a scope of improvement in this render function. This looks long to me. Maybe we can split this function into smaller functions. That can be one area of improvement we can do in this program. So, I have used entire state and I have rendered the entire state of this application. As this is a small application, maybe you can split that rendering part into smaller chunks, maybe for this section and this section, something like that. So yes, there are scope of improvement in this code. I am not saying I have written a perfect code. If you find a better way of writing this expense tracker application, do share it with me, and probably I'm going to update this with that particular code. But as I have to keep beginners in my mind, I have written this code, and I'm not going to stop here. And I'm going to put more videos, more content, more projects in this course. So this is not the first and last project of this course. Definitely I'm going to put more projects like this. So this is an easy project, I would say. I'm going to put some intermediate and advanced level of JavaScript projects also, when we will have the knowledge of advanced JavaScript also. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to see you in the next project or next video.